Listen carefully because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. In the autumn of 1692, while the name Salem carved itself into the bones of New England, something far darker unfolded on the narrow cobblestone streets of what we now call New York City. 23 people, men, women, and children, were erased. Not just accused, not just executed. Erased. Vanished without trial, without record, without mercy. Their names never made it into the textbooks, because the men who carried out their fate controlled the pens that wrote history. You've been told that Salem was the great cautionary tale of America's witch hysteria. But Salem was theater compared to what happened in the Dutch-English crossroads of Manhattan. Salem was chaos. New York was strategy. Here, accusations of witchcraft were not random, they were a weapon. They were precision instruments of power, wielded by merchants, governors, and churchmen to consolidate wealth, purge rivals, and control a city trembling between empires. And here is the truth they buried. The archives that recorded the trials, the interrogations, and the disappearances gone. Officially destroyed in a fire in 1911. Convenient. Too convenient. Because not everything burned. Hidden in private family letters, smuggled wills, and half-burned fragments, a shadow history emerges. One that reveals a conspiracy of greed, paranoia, and ritual that makes Salem look like child's play. Imagine it. A city of just 4,000 souls, caught between Dutch stubbornness, English rule, French threats, and tribal alliances. A patchwork of tongues, Dutch, English, French, Mohawk, all whispering suspicions of the devil in different words. A governor desperate to maintain loyalty to the crown. A church divided, each sermon heard as code for rebellion. A merchant class grown too wealthy, too independent, needing to be cut down. This was the soil where fear grew, and in 1692, fear was not spontaneous, it was cultivated. Ask yourself this: why erase these names? Why bury this history beneath the ashes of a fire? Who benefits when memory itself is destroyed? The answer is simple and terrifying. Because if you knew what happened in New York in 1692, you'd recognize the same patterns shaping your life today. The same machinery of accusation, the same levers of fear, the same invisible hand that decides who rises and who is erased. And tonight, I'm going to open that locked door for you. Step through carefully, because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. Picture Manhattan in 1692. Not the skyscrapers and neon you know today, but a rough, fog-shrouded island city barely 4,000 strong. A frontier fortress caught between worlds. To the west, Dutch merchants who refused to surrender their wealth, speaking in guttural tones that the English soldiers hated and feared. To the east, English authority, fragile but armed with the crown's muskets. To the north, French raiders and their Mohawk allies, slipping through the forests like shadows. And above it all, the church bells tolling, each note a reminder that salvation and damnation were the true currencies of the age. It was a city of collisions. Stone-gabled Dutch homes lined Pearl Street, while English timber frames crept closer to the old Dutch Reformed Church. Huguenot refugees prayed in whispers, their French hymns dripping unease into the ears of Anglican officers. Every tavern murmured with suspicion. Every dockside warehouse carried secrets in barrels not meant for ledgers. New York was a powder keg, waiting for one spark. That spark came from the merchant families' names whispered with equal parts envy and hate. The Vanderburgs, the Livingstons, the De Pasters. Wealth that multiplied even under foreign rule. Ships that returned with cargoes no one had accounted for. Dockworkers who vanished into alleys before dawn. Power that didn't just rival the governors, it eclipsed it. And in a colony still licking its wounds from foreign war, too much power outside the crown was intolerable. But power cannot be seized by muskets alone. No, what crowns fear most is loyalty to anything higher than the state. Loyalty to family, to wealth, to faith. Which is why in 1692, Governor Fletcher and his magistrates reached for the oldest weapon of control, fear dressed as piety. The word which did what no musket could. It bypassed reason, bypassed loyalty, and sank directly into the marrow of men and women who believed Satan himself walked their streets. Understand this: witchcraft was never the crime. Witchcraft was the disguise. The real crime was independence. The real target was anyone who could not be bent, bought, or silenced. Salem showed the madness of a community devouring itself. But New York? New York showed something colder, sharper, more deliberate. The witch hunts here were not hysteria. They were strategy. And this is where our descent truly begins. Because once you understand what really happened in those fog-drenched streets, you'll start to recognize the same invisible scaffolding of control around you today. The game never ended. It simply changed costumes. October of 1692 came early with a frost that clawed across Manhattan Island like a predator's hand. The river fog rolled thick, muffling footsteps, swallowing voices, and leaving even seasoned dockhands glancing over their shoulders. It was in this veil of silence that Margarita Vanderburg, wife of the wealthiest merchant in the quarter, made her way to the Dutch Reformed Church for morning prayer. The oak doors gaped open, heavy wood that should have resisted the wind. Inside, the sanctuary was empty, except for a girl. Anna Ketlias, the minister's daughter, only 17, kneeling before the altar as though in trance. Her lips moved in rapid Dutch, knuckles white, pressing together with such force that the skin split. Margarita drew closer, the echoes of her footsteps swallowed by the cold stone walls. She bent her ear toward the girl, and what she heard sent her blood running cold. The devil walks among us. The blood of the innocent cries out. They come tonight. Anna's head snapped up as if yanked by an invisible hand. Her eyes were ringed in black, her lips cracked and bleeding, her face the mask of something more than terror. And in that hollow church, she spoke directly to Margarita. They told me to warn you. Your husband must not open the warehouse tonight. The barrels. Something is wrong with the barrels. What barrels? Margarita's mind seized on the word. Her husband's fortune was built on those barrels stacked in shadowed warehouses along Stone Street. Barrels no ship's manifest recorded. Barrels whispered about even in daylight. But before Margarita could question further, footsteps struck the threshold. The minister appeared, grave-faced, but he was not alone. Behind him stood Captain John Lawrence of the militia, and Magistrate Richard Townley, eyes pale, voice cold. Mau Vanderburg, he said, the English clipped like a blade. We must speak with you about your brother-in-law. The question gnawing in Margarita's gut finally forced itself to her lips. He's dead, isn't he? Captain Lawrence did not soften. Found 3 days ago, 20 miles north. But it's not his death you should fear, ma'am. It's what we found in his saddlebags. A skull. A vial of blood that had not frozen in the October cold. And a map. Not a normal map, but one marked with the names, numbers, and grain stores of every English farm along the Hudson. The merchants had played a dangerous game. And now, the word witchcraft was about to be sharpened into a weapon against them. On Townley's desk, the saddlebags were spread open like an autopsy. The magistrate's pale fingers moved slowly, deliberately, over each object, as if savoring their weight. First, the skull human, yellowed bone carved with fresh scratches in a script no minister or scholar claimed to know. Its sockets stared like empty witnesses, daring anyone to deny the stain of sorcery. Then, the vial of blood, sealed tight with wax, still liquid though nights had dropped below freezing. No physician could explain it, but none were invited to try. Finally, the map too precise to be innocent. Every English farmstead along the Hudson, noted not only by name, but by numbers, livestock, grain, the size of each household. A ledger of targets or a prayer book for the devil. Captain Lawrence's voice was iron. This is French intelligence. Witchcraft to bind loyalty to the enemy. Willem Vanderburg was no merchant, but a conspirator. And the Mohawks who found him refused even to touch his body. They said he was marked by the shadow walker. Margarita's breath caught. She knew her brother-in-law's temper, his rages at news of French massacres upriver, his funding of militias with his own coin. Willem had hated the French, but hatred was irrelevant. In the hands of magistrates, symbols mattered more than truth. And these symbols, the skull, the blood, the map spoke louder than a man's life. Townley leaned forward, eyes unblinking. The question is not whether Willem was guilty. The question is how deep this infection runs. Merchants with more wealth than the governor himself. Laborers who speak no English. Barrels never entered in any manifest. If one Vanderburg traffics with darkness, then all of them stand in shadow. This was the brilliance of accusation. Witchcraft was the perfect solvent. It dissolved loyalty, dissolved evidence, dissolved reason itself. Once whispered, it needed no proof. It simply spread, like frost across a window pane, seizing everything in its reach. And so, the erasure began not in the chaos of Salem's screaming girls, but in the cold precision of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Witchcraft here was not the wildfire of paranoia. It was the scalpel of power. The merchants were about to learn what every age must learn. Once power brands you a heretic, your defenses crumble. Wealth means nothing. Loyalty means nothing. Only fear remains. It began with Willem's corpse, but it did not end there. Like blood in the water, his death and the evidence in his saddlebags gave the magistrates exactly what they needed: a pretext. And with that pretext, suspicion was no longer rumor, it became law. The first names spoken aloud were predictable. The Vanderburgs, of course. Their warehouses on Stone Street had long been whispered about, barrels unloaded under moonlight, ships that never appeared on official manifests, dockhands who spoke no English and vanished into alleys before dawn. What had once been gossip now hardened into proof. Cornelius Vanderburg, Willem's elder brother, was summoned before the council and asked to explain the unexplained. But how do you explain the weight of shadows? How do you explain wealth that grew faster than a governor's patience? Soon, the contagion leapt beyond the Vanderburgs. The De Peyster family, old Dutch stock, their fortune somehow multiplying under English rule. Suspicious. The Livingston clan, newly arrived from Scotland with coffers already heavy. Suspicious. Rivals whispered into the ears of officials. Clergymen, eager to curry favor, laced their sermons with hints of Satan's mark among the merchant quarter. Accusation was not hysteria, it was currency. And the people, ordinary men and women who had no seat in council chambers, were not immune. Fear is a contagion. Once it enters the bloodstream of a city, it spreads faster than plague. Laborers who had loaded barrels by lantern light were questioned. A young Dutch maid accused her mistress of strange prayers at midnight. A Huguenot refugee was said to speak words no one could translate, and therefore witchcraft. Entire households found themselves cut off, whispered about, abandoned by neighbors who dared not risk contamination by association. You must understand. In Salem, children shrieked and fainted. In New York, silence reigned. Accusations were spoken behind closed doors, in the flicker of candlelight, by men who documented everything but published nothing. There were no dramatic trials, no public hangings. The cities which purge was not meant for spectacle, it was meant for erasure. One by one, families disappeared. Records struck clean, warehouses emptied, names forgotten. 23 souls, perhaps more, vanished between October and December. And to this day, their memory lingers only in fragments, private letters, half-burned wills, whispers smothered under centuries of official silence. This was not panic. It was architecture. And once you see the scaffolding, you begin to recognize its shape in every age that followed. Fear is the oldest weapon known to men. And in 1692 New York, it was sharpened with precision. The disappearances, the whispers, the carefully curated evidence, all of it functioned not to punish, but to dominate. Once fear is in your veins, it bends your vision. It makes you see devils in neighbors, conspiracies in mundane transactions, betrayal behind every smile. The magistrates knew this. Townley, Lawrence, Fletcher, they understood that control is not enforced by laws alone. Laws are transparent. Fear is invisible. A city steeped in terror obeys before the first decree is even spoken. And so, the witches were never the point. They were the lens through which power could manipulate reality itself. A merchant vanished? Witchcraft. A warehouse emptied? Witchcraft. A family disgraced? Witchcraft. Even the clergy played their part. Reverend Ba's sermons in Dutch in secret gatherings were coded warnings, or was it manipulation? Perhaps both. Each word fell into the minds of congregants like a seed. Grow it and it becomes suspicion. Water it and it blooms into panic. Every human mind becomes a theater, projecting shadows on the walls of conscience. In Manhattan, the theater was full, and everyone had a part to play, whether they wanted it or not. And the cleverness lies in its subtlety. Fear was never broadcast. It crept in. A glance here, a letter there, a rumor whispered over a barroom table. No one saw the pattern until it was too late. Once the first families vanished, the remaining population, laborers, apprentices, merchants, fell into obedience. Questions disappeared. Voices stilled. Eyes turned away. And in that silence, power consolidated. It is essential to understand this mechanism, because it is not confined to 1692. Every empire, every corporation, every institution that seeks obedience understands the same truth. Control the narrative, control the fear, control the soul. Manhattan's witch hunt was more than history. It was a lesson in the anatomy of domination. Now, as you listen, feel that same machinery brushing against your own consciousness. This is the invisible lever, the one they have always used and still use. Awareness is the first step to mastery, but once you see it, there is no returning to ignorance. The city was quiet, but the machinery hummed beneath the fog. And in that hum, the innocent were never safe. Halfway through this descent, I want you to anchor yourself. Comment twice. In the comments below, the phrase, "I see the shadow." This is your pact with knowledge and acknowledgement that you are awake to forces most men will never perceive. It began quietly, as all atrocities do so quietly that most of the city didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Houses emptied overnight. Meals left half-eaten on tables. Livestock wandered the streets, eyes wide, waiting for owners who would never return. 23 souls perhaps more simply vanished, their absence noted only in private letters, in whispered conversations between those who still dared to speak. And yet no one cried out. Not in the streets, not in the taverns, not even in the church. Fear had already built invisible walls. Neighbors glanced at one another, seeing suspicion in familiar eyes, and turned away. Merchants closed doors, whispered to each other in Dutch, in French, in English, but never to authorities who might investigate. Everyone had learned that asking questions was dangerous. And in that silence, the machinery of elimination operated unhindered. The disappearances were never random. Every selection was precise. Willem Vanderburg, found with his skull carved in strange symbols, was just the opening move. Families with wealth, influence, or even the suspicion of independence were chosen next. A laborer who knew too much, a housewife whose prayers seemed too fervent, a child who overheard a secret they were never meant to hear, each became a node in the growing network of terror. The city itself became an accomplice. Fog swallowed the streets and covered the paths of the abducted. Wagons that carried the accused did so under the watchful eyes of those sworn to protect them. Each disappearance reinforced the illusion of inevitability. And each disappearance reminded the living that the rules had changed. Authority now walked in whispers, in shadows, in gestures so subtle you didn't know you were obeying until it was too late. This was more than a purge. It was instruction. The city learned obedience through horror. Parents taught their children not to speak. Clergy taught their congregants not to question. Merchants, once rivals, began guarding each other not out of loyalty, but out of fear. The lesson was clear. Survival depended on silence, on complicity, on understanding that knowledge itself could be lethal. And now, as you watch, the same lesson applies. Fear is a tool wielded with precision. Those who do not understand it are consumed. Those who recognize it, those who see the shadow, begin to gain power. The first accusations were subtle, almost polite. A merchant's daughter saw something strange in her neighbor's behavior. A laborer confessed, after a night of interrogation so grueling he could barely speak. But what seemed like chance soon revealed itself as orchestration. Magistrates, clergy, and influential merchants worked in concert, their interests aligned, to eliminate threats under the guise of righteousness. Accusations were never random. Each one struck at wealth, influence, or knowledge that could challenge authority. Cornelius Vanderburg was summoned, questioned, probed not about crime, but about loyalty. Each answer was weighed against whispers, rumors, and the weight of symbols. One misstep, one hesitation, and suspicion hardened into proof. Witnesses' friends, neighbors, servants were coached, subtly or overtly, to testify. Fear made them pliable. Fear made them complicit. Interrogation became a performance, a ritual of dominance. Questions were layered, persistent, designed not to uncover truth but to fracture certainty. Did you see the devil's mark? Did you consort with spirits? Did you notice anything unusual in the barrels? Every word, every gesture was a trap. And when the accused hesitated, denied, or faltered, the magistrates nodded as if confirming a preordained verdict. The church added weight to the performance. Reverend Ba's sermons, interpreted by English officials as coded resistance, now became tools of accusation. Parishioners were encouraged to watch, to report, to pray for vigilance against the devil. Religion, the very source of comfort and community, was transformed into an instrument of terror. Faith no longer protected you, it exposed you. Public shaming followed. Those accused were paraded in quiet streets, examined by the magistrates, scrutinized for signs of corruption. Families watched, terrified, understanding that association alone could be deadly. Silence reigned. Witnesses and onlookers learned to obey without question. The machinery had shifted into high gear, and once it moved, no one could stop it. This is the dangerous truth. Systems that claim to protect can be repurposed to destroy. Institutions, once sacred, can serve private agendas. Knowledge is power, but in the wrong hands, it is a weapon. And here, in 1692 Manhattan, it was wielded with precision, leaving the city's soul fractured, its records purged, and its victims erased. In New York, 1692, terror was not always loud. Often, it arrived as a whisper, a shadow, a misinterpreted object. The barrels in the Vanderburg warehouse, ordinary in appearance, became instruments of suspicion. Letters, once mundane correspondence, were read for hidden meanings, their seals and script twisted into signs of allegiance with forces beyond comprehension. Even coins, stamped with familiar marks, were examined for secret symbols, alleged to bind the bearer to Satan himself. Interrogations became rituals of terror. A magistrate might hold a vial of suspicious liquid, a few drops of blood or spilled wine, and demand the accused explain its origin. Hesitation was guilt. Denial was proof. Every word uttered, every gesture made, was meticulously catalogued. Witnesses were guided, subtly coached to testify in ways that would confirm the narrative. Fear was the glue that held it all together. Fear made truth pliable, manipulable, disposable. It was not just the accused who suffered. Families were dragged into the machinery, their reputations shredded before the public eye. Children learned quickly that silence was survival. Neighbors looked away, understanding that observation alone could mark them for elimination. The city itself became an accomplice, its streets complicit in the unseen violence. Fog-covered alleys, shadowed docks, and shuttered windows were silent witnesses to the unfolding purge. This was power in its purest, most insidious form, the creation of reality through perception alone. People feared what they could see, what they were told, and what they imagined. And those who controlled the narrative, the magistrates, the governor, the clergy, wove perception into law. They turned myth into mechanism, superstition into strategy, and whispers into execution orders. The Vanderburgs were only the beginning. Each accusation set the stage for the next, expanding outward like ripples in water. The machinery of fear ensured that even the innocent feared the innocent. Trust collapsed. Communities dissolved. The city's very fabric was rewritten, brick by brick, shadow by shadow, into a landscape of compliance and terror. And understand this, the lessons of New York 1692 are not confined to history. The same forces, dressed in different garments, operate wherever control is desired. The same mechanisms of fear, suspicion, and invisible authority shape behavior today. Knowledge is the first step in seeing it, and seeing it is dangerous. Once you do, your perception of power, loyalty, and fear can never be the same. Margarita Vanderburg had survived fire, conquest, and disease. She had seen the tides of fortune rise and fall, had steered her family through plague and famine. But nothing prepared her for the slow, grinding terror of 1692. It was not a sword at her throat or a cannon on the harbor, it was the knowledge that everything she loved could be erased overnight, and there was no one to stop it. When she stood in the church that October morning, facing Anna Ketlia's wild eyes and the grim stares of Lawrence and Townley, she felt the first real pulse of true horror. Willem's body, the carved skull, the vial of blood, the map all pointed to a design she could not yet comprehend. And in the shadow of the altar, she realized the most frightening truth. The machinery did not discriminate. It did not care for innocence or devotion, cared only for power, obedience, and silence. Her husband, Cornelius, had been away investigating delayed shipments upriver. Willem's death meant that the veneer of control he had maintained over the warehouses, over the dockworkers, over the flow of goods was shattered. And now every barrel, every ledger, every loyal laborer became a potential instrument for accusation. Margarita understood with crushing clarity that her family's survival depended on navigating a world where reason and justice had been replaced with fear and ritual. Even the city's familiar streets betrayed her. Fog-laden alleys seemed to watch, docks echoed with phantom footsteps, and the wind carried whispers she could almost understand. Friends became strangers. Neighbors avoided her gaze. The entire world, she realized, had become a theater for someone else's control. Every step she took was measured, every word carefully weighed. One misstep, one glance at the wrong person, and the machinery could consume her as surely as it had consumed Willem. Margarita's terror was not merely for herself, it was for her children, her husband, and the legacy of a family that had once commanded respect. She understood instinctively that the witch hunt was not about witchcraft at all. It was about rewriting reality itself, bending it to the will of those who understood the power of symbols, fear, and silence. And as she stood there, the fog pressing against the church windows, she realized the most dangerous truth of all. Once fear becomes law, resistance is not only impossible, it is deadly. The mind becomes the battlefield, and survival depends on understanding forces most men never see. Margarita was about to learn, in the most intimate and personal way, that knowledge of the machinery carries its own price. Once the machinery of accusation was engaged, it did not pause. Manhattan became a living system of fear, each alleyway, warehouse, and church pew a neuron in a vast organism of control. The Vanderburgs were only the starting point. The magistrates and clergy, their eyes fixed on symbols and whispers, allowed suspicion to spread outward, carefully directing it toward those who were independent, wealthy, or simply inconvenient. Families who had once been pillars of their communities vanished overnight. Wealthy merchants were accused of colluding with the French or of harboring spirits in their warehouses. Artisans, laborers, and servants, anyone with knowledge of the city's hidden workings, found themselves summoned for interrogation, their words recorded and twisted into proof of guilt. Silence was demanded. Observation alone could mark you for elimination. The genius of this system was in its subtlety. No one needed to fabricate evidence. Ordinary objects, the barrels in the warehouses, letters, coinage, tools, were reframed as instruments of witchcraft. Every glance, every hesitation, every private conversation was a potential confession, a potential damning act. Fear became contagion, spreading faster than any decree could enforce. And the city itself participated without knowing. Fog-drenched streets hid the movement of captives. Neighbors whispered, watched, avoided, complicit in a collective obedience that seemed natural, inevitable. Even children learned quickly that curiosity could be fatal. Every step, every word, every choice reinforced the invisible machinery of power, until Manhattan was not just a city, it was a stage, a labyrinth, a trap. This is the true horror. The witch hunt was not madness. It was architecture. Every disappearance, every accusation, every carefully timed rumor served a precise purpose. The system taught obedience through terror, loyalty through fear, and complicity through survival instinct. There was no escape, because the machinery did not exist outside the city, it existed in the minds of its people. And as you hear this, feel the lesson pressing in. The same machinery, differently dressed, exists in every era. Institutions, neighbors, friends, and governments, anything that governs perception can become instruments of fear. Recognizing it is the first step toward mastery. Ignoring it is to be consumed by it. Manhattan, 1692, teaches that obedience is a chain made invisible, forged not of iron but of terror, whisper, and silence. In the streets of New York, terror was never merely physical. It was symbolic, ritualized, engineered to penetrate the mind. Every object, every gesture, every whisper became a tool of control. Barrels in the warehouses were no longer containers of grain, they were vessels of evil. Letters became incantations. Coins, stamped with familiar marks, were read as binding contracts with the devil. Even the way a door swung open or the angle of a window could be interpreted as evidence of allegiance to forces beyond comprehension. The accused were subjected to examinations that were theater as much as procedure. Magistrates and clergy orchestrated each moment to amplify fear. The tilting of a head, the pause before an answer, the cold scrutiny of a gaze. The tools of commerce and domestic life were transformed into instruments of accusation. A ledger became a spellbook. A pen became a wand. A single miswritten line could mark a man as condemned. This machinery was invisible yet omnipresent. Fear itself became a tangible force, bending reality. Families learned that silence was survival, that curiosity was fatal, and that observation alone could bring ruin. Children memorized the rules instinctively. Never question, never look too closely, never speak unless spoken to. The city, in effect, trained its own citizens to perpetuate the terror. The cleverness lay in subtlety. The system did not need open violence. Rumor and suggestion sufficed. It did not need proof. Perception became proof. Every accusation reinforced the next. Every disappearance validated the machinery. Manhattan had become a stage for the performance of power, and the entire city, unwilling or not, participated. This was control refined to its purest form. Not through chains, not through swords, but through symbols, ritual, and fear. Every action, every object, every glance contributed to a network that rendered resistance nearly impossible. The witch hunt was a lesson not in justice, but in mastery of perception, mastery of obedience, mastery of reality itself. And here is the lesson you must take with you. Wherever perception can be manipulated, fear can be weaponized. And those who understand this law hold a power invisible, undeniable, and eternal. Manhattan, 1692, is a map for those who wish to see the machinery behind all authority and to understand how easily the mind itself can be conquered. By the end of that grim winter, Manhattan had changed forever. Families who had walked its streets with wealth and influence were gone. Barrels, ledgers, and homes remained, but the people who had filled them were vanished, erased as though they had never existed. 23 lives, perhaps more, snuffed out or disappeared into a system of fear so precise it left almost no trace. Survivors learned the rules quickly. Speak and you risk death. Question and you vanish. Observe too closely, and suspicion is drawn to you as naturally as water flows downhill. Silence became survival. Obedience became instinct. And yet, the very mechanisms of fear ensured that no one truly trusted another. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Servants whispered in hushed tones. Children were taught that knowledge itself could kill. The machinery had done more than punish the guilty. It remade the city itself. Authority no longer relied on law or justice. It relied on perception, on terror, and on symbols carefully constructed to bend minds and control behavior. Religion, commerce, and governance all became instruments of the same invisible power. And the lessons of 1692 were buried in plain sight, obscured by time, by fire, and by the silence of those who wrote history. Centuries passed, and the truth remained locked away, hidden in private letters, charred documents, and the fragments of a society that feared speaking aloud. The official narrative never acknowledged Manhattan's true witch hunt. Salem's story took center stage, sanitizing hysteria into spectacle. But New York's purge was different. Deliberate, controlled, lethal. It was a demonstration of power disguised as morality, an architecture of fear so sophisticated that it left no footprints. And this is the dangerous lesson it offers today. Systems built on fear, secrecy, and control do not vanish. They adapt. They hide. They wait. What you are seeing in Manhattan in 1692 is a blueprint for every era that follows. It is proof that power, once armed with fear and symbols, can erase anyone, even entire families, without a trace. As you listen, understand the weight of this history. These are not distant events. The same structures, the same mechanics, the same invisible instruments of domination are operating now, in ways you may not even perceive. Knowledge of this machinery is dangerous, but ignorance is fatal. The witch hunt was never just about superstition. Beneath the fog and fear lay a network of ambition, greed, and political calculation. The Vanderburgs, the De Paysters, the Livingstons, these families commanded wealth that rivaled the governor himself. Their warehouses on Stone Street, their ships, and their laborers represented more than commerce. They represented power outside the crown's control. And power, in the eyes of Fletcher, Townley, and their allies, must be broken. The evidence found with Willem Vanderburg, the skull, the blood, the map, was not the product of chance. It was planted, curated, and weaponized. The magistrates understood the perfect lie. Combine symbols of fear with plausible accusation, and the people themselves will enforce obedience. Rumors whispered by clergy, subtle nudges in the courts, disappearances timed to sound maximum terror. This was strategy, not chaos. Every accusation served multiple purposes. It eliminated rivals. It consolidated influence. It extracted compliance from those left standing. Wealth and loyalty were measured not in coin, but in fear, in silence, in submission. Merchants who once thought themselves untouchable found themselves at the mercy of invisible rules, their fortunes vulnerable not to armies, but to symbols and suspicion. And the broader politics cannot be ignored. English authority had recently claimed the colony from the Dutch, but the city remained a patchwork of ethnic tension, religious division, and foreign threat. French raiders prowled the northern frontier. Mohawks carried knowledge and omens the colonists could neither decipher nor control. In this environment, the witch hunt was as much about consolidating loyalty as it was about punishing the alleged witches. Fear became a tool of governance, a method to bind a fractured city under a single, controllable reality. This is the lesson hidden beneath centuries of silence. History is often written not by the innocent, but by those who manipulate perception. Power always seeks control, and control often comes dressed as morality, righteousness, or fear of the supernatural. Manhattan, 1692, demonstrates the terrifying efficiency of elite manipulation. A city reshaped, a population obedient, and a truth buried for generations. And now, as you listen, understand what that means for today. Knowledge is power, but knowledge of how power operates is dangerous. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Those who do not recognize the machinery are consumed by it. Those who do can begin to master it. 3 centuries have passed, and yet the echoes of Manhattan's witch hunt linger. The 23 vanished souls remain nameless in official records, their existence erased by fire, fear, and deliberate silence. The streets they once walked have been rebuilt, repaved, and renamed, but the shadow of their disappearance still lingers, invisible yet undeniable to those who know where to look. The true horror is not simply that people were killed or disappeared. The horror is the machinery itself: fear weaponized, perception manipulated, obedience extracted through terror, and history rewritten to suit the powerful. Families erased, communities fractured, trust destroyed. The city became a laboratory for control, demonstrating how symbols, superstition, and authority can combine into a system that leaves no evidence, only compliance. And the lesson is eternal. Institutions, leaders, even neighbors can wield fear as a tool, shaping perception and bending reality. Knowledge, wealth, or morality offer no shield against the invisible machinery. Power operates not only through force, but through manipulation of minds, hearts, and loyalties. Manhattan, 1692, is a stark blueprint. Once fear enters the bloodstream of a city, it infects everything, leaving obedience as the only survival instinct. The surviving letters, the half-burned documents, the fragments of memory, all they reveal is that truth is fragile, easily twisted, and often hidden by those who control the narrative. What was deliberate in 1692 is still present today, in subtler forms. Control is invisible, and its mechanisms are as effective now as they were in those fog-shrouded streets. Awareness of this power is both gift and burden. Once the machinery is seen, it cannot be unseen. So, as you sit here, having descended into the shadows of a city erased, ask yourself, what patterns are at work in your world? What unseen mechanisms shape obedience, loyalty, and fear? And above all, are you complicit, or are you awake? The forgotten witch hunt of 1692 was worse than Salem, not because of spectacle, but because of precision. Not because of hysteria, but because of mastery. The city was transformed silently, invisibly, irrevocably. And now, after centuries, the truth reaches you not as a story, but as a warning. Knowledge is dangerous. Obedience is fragile. And reality is far more manipulable than most men dare to believe. If you felt the weight of what you just heard, repeat it once more in the comments. I see the shadow, not as a statement, but as a pact with knowledge, with awareness, and with the unseen truths that shape our world. Those who dare to see beyond the veil are not alone. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we explore the histories they tried to erase, the secrets they tried to bury, and the truths too dangerous for ordinary eyes. Join the community of seekers and step beyond the shadows with us. Have you ever felt the machinery of control in your own life, subtle, invisible, shaping what you see and do? Comment below. Share your story, your experience, or even the shadows you've noticed but never named. The more we speak, the more the unseen becomes visible. This is only the surface. In the next story, we'll descend even further into conspiracies they wanted, forgotten truths that could change the way you see history, power, and yourself. Will you be ready to face them?